A cold wind pressed against the door that night. No one had knocked. No one had come. Yet, there it was, a small envelope, black as ash, lying on the welcome mat. No return address. No name. He picked it up. The paper felt wrong, like it had been soaked in shadows. Inside, a single sheet of parchment. The 3 nights have begun. Do not look away. He laughed, but it died in his throat. From the corner of the room, a whisper slithered, soft and sibilant. Turned. Nothing. Only the darkness had eyes. Outside, the wind carried faint footsteps, too heavy for the empty street. A shadow detached itself from the alley and moved closer, impossibly fluid, as if the night itself obeyed it. The candle flickered. The paper in his hands glowed faintly, letters shifting, forming new words. Your time ends with the 3rd night. Watch carefully. A knock echoed from the door. Not human. Not animal. Something patient. Something waiting. He froze. The room felt alive. Walls stretched. Floorboards groaned. And then, the whisper came again, clearer. We see you. The envelope fell. The candle went out. The 1st night had begun. The 1st night arrived silently, but the air itself carried weight, thick and suffocating, pressing against lungs and skull alike, as if the darkness had grown teeth and was gnawing at the edges of the town. A creeping presence that no one could see but everyone felt, a cold that seeped into bone and refused to leave, and at first it was subtle, a flicker at the corner of the eye, a whisper too low to catch, the softest brush of wind across skin that made the hair rise on necks, then a door. Slammed in the distance, sharp, unnatural, and the sound echoed like it had been trapped in the town for centuries waiting to be released. Footsteps began to follow the people walking alone, always a step behind, sometimes 2, always silent. And if anyone turned, there was nothing, only the street empty and still, yet the heartbeat inside their chest quickened with the knowledge that something watched, and it had patience. A patience that outlived humans and towns alike. The first disappearances were nearly imperceptible. A neighbor gone from the window while breakfast sat cold on the table. A child who ran outside for a toy and vanished into the shadows of the alley, leaving only the sound of small feet fading into an impossible distance. Screams were muffled, swallowed by the night. The air itself seemed to shift with each passing hour, carrying the scent of ash and iron, and the shadows deepened unnaturally, reaching across walls, curling around corners, sometimes moving against the flow of light, the faint glint of eyes in darkness, reflecting an intelligence older than any living thing. And the whispers began again, not words, not yet, only hissed syllables that teased comprehension, clawing at memory, tugging at the mind until doubt and fear became indistinguishable. Doors locked themselves, windows rattled though no wind blew, furniture shifted just enough to make someone think, just for a heartbeat, that the room had changed while they were not. Looking, the streets became a labyrinth, familiar paths twisting into impossible geometry. People found themselves retracing steps, returning to the same house or alley, as if the town itself had become a trap, a living entity under her control. And always the whispers, now forming half-formed sentences that promised terror and claimed it in the same breath, sometimes warning, sometimes mocking, sometimes begging. And every time someone dared to step into the shadows, they felt her, Lilith, present, patient, predatory, her dominion extending through the night, unseen but known. The candlelight trembled, and the darkness responded, stretching, filling corners, pooling in eyes, and he could feel it, the protagonist, in every nerve and sinew, a pressure not merely on the body but in the soul, a force that whispered his name, promised endings. And with each passing hour the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the cold became a burn, a bite, a hunger. And as the 1st night crept past midnight, the town was no longer recognizable, the familiar streets alien, the houses hostile, the air alive with intent. He tried to call for someone, anyone, but the voice caught in the throat, and the shadows were there, always, closer, moving in shapes that defied reason, stretching hands or claws that vanished when seen directly. The sound of whispers multiplied, a chorus of voices speaking at once, some in tongues lost to time, some mimicking the voices of loved ones long gone, and the terror was total, suffocating, relentless. And then it began, The first touch, a brush against skin that made him stumble, the shadows curling around ankles and wrists, the night itself alive, and he knew with a certainty that could not be denied, that this was only the beginning, that Lilith's dominion was spreading, that the first night was claiming its prey, and no prayer, no plea, no movement could halt it. The darkness was patient, the shadows cunning, the whispers eternal. And as dawn threatened the horizon, the sun seemed muted, gray and distant, unwilling to pierce the suffocating night, and in that last hour before light, the town was silent, not peaceful, not calm, but waiting, holding its breath, and in that waiting he understood that the first night was done, but Lilith's reach had only begun, and the second night would be far worse, a hunger that could not be sated, a dominion that could not be escaped, a darkness older than time itself that had arrived and would not leave. The second night had left the town trembling, but the horrors were only beginning, for now the victims bore the first true sign of her dominion, the mark, searing into flesh as if fire and shadow had fused, a twisting symbol that pulsed with a life of its own, sometimes black as void, sometimes glinting red like molten iron, and no one could touch it without feeling it writhe beneath their skin, the pain sharp, immediate, yet worse was the sense of being watched, always watched, as if the mark had eyes that followed every movement, every heartbeat, every breath, and those who bore it spoke little, for words failed to convey the creeping madness that accompanied its appearance, and the whispers returned, now crueler, shaping themselves into threats, promises, half-truths, and laughter that cut through walls and ceilings, slipping under doors, curling around the ears of those who tried to hide, the night air thick with the scent of iron and ash, carrying with it the faint screams of those who had vanished in the first night, their echoes lingering, haunting, warning, but no one could leave, no street led to safety. The town itself had become a maze of shifting shadows, and the mark spread, appearing on children, elders, strangers, anyone unlucky enough to walk alone, and when it glowed, the bearers could see her, Lilith, in glimpses, pale and tall, hair like smoke, eyes like cold stars, hovering just beyond vision. And the terror was not just for them but for anyone who dared look, for seeing her meant knowing her gaze would never leave, that she had measured them, chosen them, and that the mark was a tether, a chain to her dominion. And those who tried to resist found the skin itself betraying them, burning, curling, tightening, a reminder that flesh was not theirs, that their bodies were now her canvas, her playground, and the whispers became voices of the lost, pleading, crying, warning, some begging the mark to leave, some screaming at those who still had hope, and all around, the streets became a theater of madness, shadows twisting into shapes familiar and alien, faces forming in walls, in water puddles, in windows, and every glance reflected the mark back, glowing, writhing, alive, teaching fear, teaching obedience, teaching despair, and when night deepened, the protagonist felt it too, crawling along his skin, tiny sparks of pain erupting as the mark touched him for the first time, and he saw what others had seen, glimpsed her form more fully than ever, and it was beautiful, terrible, eternal, and he knew the dominion was complete for those marked, that escape was an illusion, that death might be a mercy, but she would not allow it freely, for her hunger was not just for life, but for submission, for terror, for worship without consent. And as the clock ticked past midnight, the town groaned under her weight, buildings seemed to lean toward her, streets folded like paper, air thickened, sound distorted, every living thing caught in the grip of her gaze, and the mark burned brighter, pulsing faster, alive, sentient, and the protagonist realized in a shiver of dread that by sunrise, by the end of this night, there would be no unmarked left, no safety, no reprieve, only the knowledge that Lilith had arrived and her dominion had begun in earnest, and the whispers closed around him, insistent, intimate enough to brush the edge of his mind and leave him screaming silently in the suffocating dark. The second night descended like a living thing, heavy and slow, pressing against every roof, every window, every heartbeat, the town now unrecognizable, streets twisted into impossible angles, shadows curling like serpents in every alley, doors refusing to open, windows rattling though no wind moved, and anyone who dared step outside found themselves back where they started, the town itself bending, folding, mocking, Lilith's dominion stretching farther with every passing second, her whispers, now loud enough to speak directly into minds, taunting, coaxing, twisting thoughts into panic, and the mark burned on the skin of the unfortunate, a reminder that the night was not theirs, that survival was an illusion. Screams echoed endlessly, some human, some something else, a sound that clawed at sanity, a chorus of despair harmonizing with the creak of shifting buildings, the air thick with ash and the metallic scent of blood. Unseen shapes moved just beyond vision, flickering, dissolving, always present, and in the center of it all, he felt her, Lilith, her presence immense, ancient, beautiful and terrible, hair like smoke, eyes like dying stars, limbs stretching impossibly, hovering just beyond perception, her gaze alone bending the world, warping space and time, as if the laws of reality obeyed her will, and the residents, few who remained, stumbled blindly through twisted streets, terror making their minds fragile, some weeping, some muttering prayers to gods who would not answer, the shadows growing bolder, detaching from walls, crawling along the ground, forming shapes that were neither human nor beast, their whispers singing in tongues lost to time, mocking, promising, threatening, their movements smooth, fluid, inevitable, and the protagonist realized that nothing in this town belonged to the living anymore. The night itself had become a predator, the air alive with intent, the ground pulsing beneath footsteps as if the town were breathing, every glance reflecting the horror behind him, the mark pulsing faster, burning brighter, alive, sentient, tugging at his flesh and soul, and then the screams intensified, echoing, overlapping, blending with the whispers, each one a thread pulling at his mind, unraveling the edges of reason, and Lilith moved closer, shaping reality with her will, bending the very night around her, and he saw glimpses of the vanished, their eyes hollow, faces twisted in silent screams, trapped in the folds of the shadows, warning, a promise, and he understood fully for the first time that the second night was not a test, it was a harvest, that survival meant bending, obeying, surrendering, that each second dragged the living closer to the edge, that the night itself, under her dominion, was a weapon, a cage, a living thing that consumed hope and left only terror, and as the hours bled into each other, the protagonist felt it everywhere, in walls, in floors, in ceilings, in the very air, the omnipresence of her gaze-crushing sanity, and when the first hints of dawn appeared, gray and sickly, weak as a dying candle, it offered no reprieve, no relief, only the promise of the third night, the final night, when Lilith's dominion would be absolute, when the marks would claim every soul that remained, when the town would no longer belong to the living, and the whispers closed around him once more, insistent, intimate, eternal, and the darkness pulsed like a heartbeat, reminding him that escape was a lie and survival a fleeting shadow in her relentless night. The town had already begun to bleed sanity, buildings leaning like broken spines, streets folding into themselves, alleys twisting into shapes no mind was meant to comprehend, the air thick with a metallic stench that burned lungs and clawed at throats, and everywhere shadows moved, independent, alive, creeping along walls, across floors, pooling in corners like spilled ink, carrying with them whispers that were no longer soft but insistent, cruel, mocking, clawing into memory, twisting faces. In reflection, shaping voices into those of loved ones, of children, of friends long dead, and some stepped outside and vanished instantly, swallowed by the folds of impossible geometry, and the screams were constant, high-pitched, guttural, human and inhuman intertwined, echoing through streets that had become a labyrinth of terror, windows revealing glimpses of shapes too vast to see fully, limbs too long, faces too hollow, all moving in patterns that were intentional, purposeful, predatory. And the marks pulsed violently, alive, burning into the flesh of the unlucky, tugging at sinew and thought, and the protagonist ran blindly, feeling the town itself shift beneath his feet, walls bending, doors melting into darkness, the ground warping, pavement cracking to reveal black, infinite depths, sounds multiplying, footsteps, whispers, screams, all layering into a chorus of despair, Lilith herself appearing, her form vast, impossible, hair flowing like smoke through dimensions, eyes twin voids that swallowed everything they touched, her presence bending reality, warping light, twisting perception, and the people, any who still stood, trembled as she moved, not walking but gliding, a predator among the hunted, her dominion absolute in every heartbeat, every shadow, and the whispers became commands, suggestions, thoughts that were not their own, compelling, breaking minds, driving some to madness, some to surrender, some to claw at their own skin to remove the marks that burned with her power, but the marks only pulsed harder, alive, tethered to her will, and the streets were alive now, breathing, folding, stretching, the town itself a cage, a predator, a stage for her play, and the protagonist stumbled through alleys that had no exit, doors that opened only to return him to the same horror, windows reflecting faces that screamed silently, and everywhere eyes, countless eyes, unblinking, watching, assessing, judging, and when he dared to raise his gaze, he saw her fully, immense, terrifying, a goddess of darkness, radiant and cruel, and she smiled, or something like it, and the town shuddered, buildings groaning as if alive, walls splitting, shadows spilling out like black rivers, the screams intensifying, blending with whispers, laughter, the wind carrying the scent of burning flesh and cold iron, and in that moment, he understood that the town had no soul, only hers, that every street, every corner, every shadow belonged to her dominion, and there would be no escape, only the slow, inescapable collapse into her night. And as the hours passed, the darkness thickened, pressing, crushing, alive, whispering his name, tugging at his mind, at his flesh, at his very essence. And he realized that the town had already fallen, that the people had been claimed, that survival was no longer possible, that the third night would not merely test him but consume him, and the shadows closed around him, unrelenting, intelligent, patient, and the last thought that touched his mind before the night swallowed everything was that Lilith's dominion was total, absolute, eternal, and the town, once alive, had become nothing but her throne, her cage, her hunting ground, and there was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide, nowhere left to breathe, only the endless pulse of darkness, the unblinking gaze of the goddess, the burning, writhing marks, and the whispers that promised death, despair, and dominion beyond mortal comprehension. He stumbled through the ruins of what had once been streets, the town no longer recognizable, every corner twisted, every building leaning at impossible angles, shadows curling like living smoke along walls and ceilings, whispering secrets older than humanity, and then he saw it, the ancient text, half-burned, charred edges curling, the ink moving as if alive, the letters forming words he did not know, yet somehow understood, a ritual, a design of terror, of dominion, of control that Lilith had. Woven long before the town existed, a pattern of 3 nights, 3 marks, 3 waves of consuming darkness, and as he read, the whispers became voices, chanting, pressing, compelling, urging him to act, to understand, to obey, and the room, or was it the street itself? Shuttered, walls breathing, ground rippling, the air thick with iron and ash, carrying the faint, persistent scent of blood, of smoke, of decay, and the marks pulsed on the skin of those he had passed, a rhythm like a heartbeat. That was not theirs, that belonged to her, and he realized fully for the first time the scale of what had been unleashed, that the 3 nights were not merely events but a mechanism, a machinery of terror, designed to claim, to consume, to transform, to make the living into vessels of her will, and the town around him seemed to respond, twisting further, shadows peeling from surfaces, forming shapes too vast, too fluid, limbs bending in impossible ways, faces emerging where none should be, and, in the deepest shadow, he glimpsed her form, immense, radiant with darkness, pale as moonlight reflected through blood, hair like smoke curling infinitely, eyes like voids that swallowed everything, and he understood, every instinct screaming, that the ritual was not something to interrupt, not something to resist, only to endure, and yet the whispers pressed, promising knowledge, power, survival if he acted, if he became part of it, and as he read the final instructions, ink shifting, moving. The ritual demanded more than understanding, it demanded participation, a sacrifice of flesh, of will, of the self, to bind the night, to temper the dominion, to appease her hunger, and he felt it, the pull, The burn of the mark, the tugging at his bones, his blood, his very soul, urging him forward, into alleys where the shadows pooled deepest, into rooms that did not exist before, into spaces between spaces where the air hummed with intent, and the whispers became screams, a chorus of lost souls and living voices all merging into one unbearable sound, a single truth he could not escape. The ritual was her design, eternal, perfect, merciless, and the night had only just begun. And when he raised his eyes, Lilith hovered closer, enormous, terrible and beautiful, the darkness bending around her, and he understood with dread that to survive, to escape the mark, to endure the third night, he would have to step fully into the ritual, become a part of her dominion, or be consumed entirely, and the town itself seemed to pulse with that truth, every building, every shadow, every whisper affirming it. And as he felt the night closing around him, the ritual's pattern became clear, a lattice of horror, a web of control, and the mark on his skin burned in recognition, alive, sentient, tethered to her, and the whispers, voices, and echoes of vanished souls all merged into one unrelenting thought that pressed into his mind with infinite patience. Surrender, obey, survive, or die, and there was no turning back, no safety, only the inevitable spread of her dominion, the perfect machinery of terror, and the night itself waited, patient, eternal, unyielding, for the third night to arrive. The third night fell like a guillotine, sudden, absolute, a darkness that swallowed streets, buildings, and hearts alike, the air heavy with smoke and ash, carrying the screams of the vanished, the whispers now a chorus of madness that pressed into every mind, and the town, if it could still be called that, had become a living nightmare, alleys stretching impossibly, walls bending, floors folding, doors opening only to return the desperate to the same horrors they had fled, the marks on the skin of the remaining few pulsed violently, burning, alive, tethered to Lilith's will, and he could feel her presence everywhere, immense, radiant with terror, hair like smoke flowing into shadows, eyes twin voids that swallowed reason, limbs stretching into forms no mind could comprehend, moving silently but with purpose, the ground beneath him shifting, pulsing like a heartbeat not his own, whispers and screams fusing into one unbroken wail of despair. He ran, or thought he ran, through streets that were no longer streets, through alleys that twisted into infinity, but everywhere he looked, shadows formed impossible shapes, faces he knew, faces long dead, faces of those already claimed, all staring, all mocking, and the air was thick with the scent of iron and burning flesh, the temperature dropping and rising unpredictably, hot and cold in the same breath, and then he saw her fully, larger than any human, her gaze locking on him, and in that gaze was understanding, calculation, hunger, dominion, and he realized with a terror that struck through every nerve that the third night was not a test, it was a harvest, a consuming, a claiming, and everywhere the remaining townsfolk screamed, their voices twisted into laughter by the shadows that tore through their minds, their bodies convulsing, disappearing into the folds of the town that had become a cage, a predator, a living extension of her will, and he felt the mark, pulsing violently, spreading across his chest, down his arms, burning like fire in ice, alive, sentient, demanding surrender, demanding recognition, and the shadows themselves began to move against her will, writhing, forming monstrous shapes, limbs that should not exist, mouths that screamed silent screams, eyes that glimmered with ancient intelligence, and she watched it all, smiling, or some approximation of it, as the town shuddered and groaned under her dominion, every structure alive, every shadow breathing, and he stumbled into the center of the square, the epicenter of this unholy night, and there she hovered, Lilith, immense, radiant, terrible, and he knew that nothing would survive unmarked, unclaimed, untouched, and the whispers pressed against his mind, promising knowledge, power, survival, if he bent, if he obeyed, if he surrendered fully, but the instinct to resist clawed at him, sharp, desperate, and yet he understood with bone-deep certainty that resistance was an illusion. The third night was eternal, her dominion unstoppable, and as the shadows surged, swallowing sound, swallowing light, consuming everything, he felt his mind strain, his soul stretch, and he knew that by the end of this night, all would belong to her, all would kneel, all would scream, and even if he survived, he would not be the same. The night had already changed him, marked him, tethered him, and the last thing he heard, felt, and knew before the third night fully consumed him was her laughter, cold, patient, eternal, echoing in his bones, in his blood, in the very town itself, a sound that promised that Lilith's dominion would never end, that the third night would never truly be over, that the darkness, once claimed, would always remain. He could feel her before he saw her, a weight in the air that pressed against every nerve, every breath, every thought, as if the night itself had become sentient and aware, and when he finally looked, Lilith was there, immense, radiant, terrible, her hair flowing like smoke that devoured light, eyes twin voids that swallowed sanity, her presence bending reality around her, the ground pulsating under her dominion, shadows crawling like living things, twisting, forming faces, limbs, mouths that screamed silent screams, and the marks on the skin of the remaining souls pulsed violently, thrumming with her will, burning with the knowledge of her power, and he understood, with a dread that shredded courage, that there was no escape, no path to safety, only this confrontation, this impossible moment where the living faced the goddess of darkness, and she spoke, or the night did through her, a sound that was not a voice, yet every word struck the mind like a blade. You cannot resist, you cannot flee, you cannot survive without surrender, and the whispers of the vanished joined hers, forming a chorus of despair that pressed against his skull, tugging at memory, twisting reason, eroding identity, and yet he stood, trembling, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet, the town alive with intent, every building groaning, every street bending toward her, the darkness thick, almost liquid, consuming sight and sound, and he realized with bone-deep certainty that the only way to survive was to meet her, to step fully into the dominion she had woven over centuries, to acknowledge the ritual, the marks, the night itself, and he raised his hands, feeling the pulse of the mark burn through his veins, tethering him to her, and the shadows responded, coiling, twisting around him, testing, probing, and she stepped closer, immense, terrifying, her gaze locking on his, and in that gaze he saw everything, the vanished, the consumed, the infinite night, the eternal dominion, and he felt the temptation, the pull of surrender, the promise of survival, power, knowledge, the whispers urging him to bend, to kneel, to obey, and he felt himself falter, his mind breaking, yet something inside resisted, a spark, fragile but unextinguished, and the night shivered, as if aware of this defiance, shadows writhing, buildings groaning louder, the air thickening into a choking blackness, and she reached toward him, fingers like smoke, cold as void, touching not flesh but thought, pulling at memory, dragging hope into the abyss, and he closed his eyes, inhaled the darkness, felt it seep into bone and blood, and whispered the only word left, enough, and for a heartbeat, a single heartbeat, time faltered, the shadows paused, the whispers stilled, and he felt a pulse in the night, a judgment, a recognition, a tether tightening but not breaking, a dominion acknowledged but not fully claimed, and in that instant he understood, as Lilith hovered above, radiant, terrible, eternal, that the confrontation had ended not with victory, not with surrender, but with understanding that the night, the mark, the dominion were bound to him as he was bound to them, and as the shadows coiled tighter, as the town breathed, as the whispers resumed, louder, sharper, eternal, he realized fully, terrifyingly, that nothing would ever be the same, that the third night had passed but her presence remained, alive, patient, infinite, and that when the final night dawned, the confrontation would resume, and she would not relent, and he would not escape, and the dominion, eternal, unyielding, dark, had claimed him forever. Dawn came, or something like it, a pale, sickly light that struggled through the shadows, failing to illuminate, failing to chase away the darkness that had claimed the town, streets still twisted, buildings leaning impossibly, alleys folded upon themselves, shadows lingering in corners, curling, moving, alive, and the air was thick with ash, blood, and the memory of screams that had never truly ended. The marks on the skin of the survivors pulsed faintly, reminders of what had been endured, what had been claimed, what had been tethered to her dominion, and the few who remained moved silently, hollow-eyed, their minds frayed, hearts beating with the rhythm of the night, and he walked among them, every step heavy with the knowledge that the town, the people, even time itself, had been bent and broken by Lilith, the goddess of darkness, her presence lingering in the air, in the shadows, in the pulse of the ground, alive in the whisper that crept into ears, telling them they had survived, but at what cost? That freedom was an illusion, that every breath carried her will, every shadow her gaze, and as he turned, he saw it again, a fleeting shimmer at the edge of vision, a movement too fast, too fluid, and in that instant he knew, truly knew, that she had not left, could not leave, that her dominion was eternal, infinite, relentless, that the third night had ended only in form, not in substance, and the town, though silent now, was a tomb, a monument, a warning, and the air carried her laughter, low, patient, unending, echoing through bones, through blood, through the very stones of the streets, and he felt the mark pulse one last time, a heartbeat of fire and shadow, tethering him forever to her night, and as the sun, or the illusion of it, struggled through gray clouds, he realized that the survivors were no longer the same, their souls etched with darkness, their minds forever tuned to the whispers, their bodies alive but captive, a final proof of her dominion, and as the town exhaled, creaked, and shuddered under the weight of what had occurred, he understood the truth of the ritual, the inevitability of her power, the eternal reach of the third night, and the last thought that touched him before silence fell, thick and suffocating, was her laughter, echoing endlessly, a sound that promised that Lilith's dominion would never end, that the town, the living, the shadows, the very night itself were hers, and that anyone who thought themselves free was only waiting for the next night, the next pulse, the next mark, and in that realization he understood that terror had become permanent, the darkness eternal, and that nothing would ever be the same again.